What are you waiting for, Sergeant? Salute me now. That's what the American lieutenant colonel demanded in front of the entire palace. But the Royal Guard's response, it didn't just silence the officer, it left the whole crowd stunned and taught a lesson in military discipline that no one saw coming. Want to know what really happened? First, hit that subscribe button and comment below where you're watching from. That being said, let's get into it. The gleaming black motorcade swept through the palace gates with practiced precision, coming to a smooth stop near the visitors' entrance of Buckingham Palace. A light morning mist hung in the air, softening the edges of the historic stonework while amplifying the vibrant colors of the meticulously maintained gardens. The palace grounds bustled with the usual mixture of tourists and official visitors. Their excited murmurs created a constant backdrop against which the day's events would unfold. The vehicles bore diplomatic flags, indicating the arrival of the American military delegation for the annual NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Curious onlookers paused to observe the formal arrival, many raising phones to capture the moment. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes of the United States Marine Corps stepped out, adjusting his immaculate uniform with military precision. Each medal and ribbon told the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple combat zones. His expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes betrayed a hint of dismissive assessment as he surveyed the palace grounds, taking in the ceremonial pageantry with barely concealed impatience. All this pomp for what's essentially a glorified meeting, he remarked to Major Davis beside him. We could have hosted this at the Pentagon and saved everyone the theatrical entrance. Major Davis gave a non-committal nod, his attention already drawn to the iconic figure standing at attention nearby. A royal guard in full ceremonial regalia, scarlet tunic brilliant against the backdrop of weathered palace stonework. Sergeant William Barrett stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward in the disciplined 1,000-yard stare perfected through years of service. Hayes's gaze followed Davis's, lingering on Barrett with undisguised skepticism. Without warning, he veered from the group, breaking the carefully choreographed arrival protocol to approach the guard. He circled Barrett slowly, examining him as one might inspect military equipment. Incredible detail on the uniform, he commented to no one in particular, his tone somewhere between grudging admiration and mockery. Though I wonder how practical that bearskin hat would be in an actual combat zone. Lieutenant Colonel, came a polite but firm voice. Edward Fleming, the palace tour coordinator, approached with a diplomatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. If you'd kindly rejoin your group, we have a rather precisely timed schedule to maintain. As the delegation walked the palace grounds, Hayes remained distracted, his attention repeatedly drawn to the royal guards positioned at various points. "Tell me," Hayes said suddenly, interrupting Fleming's explanation about the historic rose varieties. "These guards, they're just ceremonial, right? For the tourists." Before Fleming could respond, Hayes turned to his American colleagues. "It's like having mannequins in uniform. Back home, we put our soldiers to actual use." Colonel Wilson, the senior American officer, frowned slightly. "The Royal Guards are an operational battalion of the British Army, Jackson. They rotate between ceremonial duties and regular deployments." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Seems inefficient to have combat-trained personnel standing like statues. In the Corps, we optimize utility." Across the garden, Captain Richard Wells of the Royal Guard Command noticed the American officer's gestures toward Barrett's position. Having overseen the Royal Guards for 7 years, Wells had developed an instinct for identifying potential incidents before they occurred. What Hayes couldn't know was that Sergeant William Barrett had been specifically selected for today's duty because of his exceptional discipline and judgment. Just 3 months prior, Barrett had completed his 4th combat deployment, serving with distinction in a classified joint operation where his unit had extracted high-value intelligence assets under heavy fire. That operation had earned Barrett the Military Cross for valor, though the precise details remained classified. His personnel file contained commendations from American Special Forces commanders who had described Barrett as unflappable under extreme pressure and exhibiting extraordinary discipline in chaotic conditions. The same qualities that made him exceptional in combat made him perfect for Royal Guard duty, where the mental discipline required to maintain ceremonial precision complemented the control needed in battlefield situations. "I served alongside the Queen's Guard in Helmand Province," offered Major Holay, a British military attaché accompanying the group. "Some of the finest soldiers I've encountered." Hayes gave Holay a skeptical look. "No disrespect to your forces, Major, but there's a difference between theatrical performance and combat readiness. These palace mannequins might look impressive, but modern warfare demands constant training and tactical flexibility, not standing still for hours." "We'll take a brief moment here to admire the western facade before continuing to the changing of the guard ceremony," Fleming announced to the delegation. As the group dispersed slightly to take photographs, Hayes seized the opportunity, slipping away with practiced ease. He moved with purpose across the grounds, straight toward Sergeant Barrett's post. Hayes positioned himself directly in Barrett's line of sight, deliberately inserting himself into the guard's 1,000-yard stare. "Impressive discipline," he remarked, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Though I wonder what tactical advantage comes from standing motionless while a potential threat evaluates your position." A small group of tourists had gathered nearby, sensing the unusual interaction. Most visitors maintained a respectful distance from the guards, but Hayes closed to within arm's length, examining Barrett with the critical eye of a drill instructor finding fault with a new recruit. "In the Corps, we train our Marines to respond to threats, not ignore them," Hayes continued, circling Barrett slowly. "This ceremonial rigidity might look good on postcards, but military effectiveness is measured by adaptability. Wouldn't you agree?" Barrett remained perfectly still, giving no indication he'd heard the provocative comments. "Lieutenant Colonel," called Major Davis, who had noticed Hayes's absence and followed him. "The delegation is moving on." Hayes waved him off without looking back. "Just having a professional exchange with our British counterpart here." His emphasis on professional carried unmistakable sarcasm. Davis finally succeeded in pulling Hayes away, but the lieutenant colonel paused, looking directly into Barrett's eyes. "We'll continue this discussion later, Sergeant," he said, misreading the insignia on Barrett's uniform. "I'm curious to see how this ceremonial training translates to real military engagement." The delegation had progressed halfway through their tour when Hayes broke away again, this time with such deliberate purpose that even Colonel Wilson's sharp eyes failed to slow his stride. A larger crowd had gathered near the guard, the mid-morning tour groups arriving with their cameras and guidebooks. Hayes positioned himself directly before Barrett, whose eyes remained fixed forward in perfect discipline. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a senior officer addressing troops, You're witnessing an interesting contrast in military philosophies today. He gestured toward Barrett. This represents the British approach. Ceremonial precision valued over combat readiness. In my 22 years with the United States Marine Corps, Hayes continued, I have led men through 3 combat deployments, Baghdad, Fallujah, and Helmand Province. In each instance, our success depended on adaptability, tactical awareness, and immediate response to changing threats. He turned toward Barrett. Tell me, Sergeant, how does standing motionless prepare? You for the chaos of modern combat? An elderly man in a blazer adorned with British military medals stepped closer. Young man, you're out of line, he said quietly but firmly. These guardsmen have served in the same combat zones you mentioned. Their ceremonial duty represents discipline, not deficiency. Hayes turned, assessing the older man with a quick glance at his medals. With respect, sir, I'm simply highlighting different approaches to military readiness. A soldier who spends hours practicing standing still is not developing the tactical flexibility modern warfare demands. Hayes stepped even closer to Barrett, violating the respectful distance maintained by other visitors. You know what impresses me about American forces? He continued, his voice carrying across the grounds. When a Marine is addressed by a superior officer, they respond. They engage. They don't hide behind ceremonial protocols. A woman in the crowd gasped as Hayes moved within inches of Barrett, close enough that his next words were meant for the guard alone, though they carried to those nearby. Have you ever actually seen combat, Sergeant? Or did they put you here because you look good in red? Lieutenant Colonel Hayes! Colonel Wilson's voice cut through the tension as he finally broke free from his diplomatic obligations. Rejoin the delegation immediately! The delegation's scheduled viewing of the changing of the guard ceremony provided Hayes with his opportunity. As the crowds shifted position for better viewing angles, he slipped away unnoticed, moving with purposeful strides toward Barrett's post. By the time Major Davis realized his colleague had disappeared again, Hayes was already approaching Barrett, whose perfect stillness remained unbroken despite the earlier confrontations. Your ceremonial changing of the guard is quite the performance, Hayes announced as he positioned himself directly in Barrett's line of sight. Impressive choreography, I'll grant you that. But in the Marines, we change posts with efficiency, not pageantry. Let me explain something about military protocol. Hayes continued, projecting his voice like a lecturer addressing a classroom. Across NATO forces, there exists a universal understanding of chain of command. Regardless of national differences, military courtesy demands that junior officers acknowledge senior officers. He tapped the insignia on his own uniform. Lieutenant Colonel, United States Marine Corps, combat decorations, from 3 theaters of operation, command experience in joint force operations. His finger jabbed toward Barrett. And you? What? A sergeant whose primary skill is standing still. Hayes began to circle Barrett with the measured pace of a drill instructor inspecting a recruit. Your uniform is impressive, Sergeant. Very historical. His tone made the words sound like an insult. He reached out suddenly, touching the sleeve of Barrett's scarlet tunic between thumb and forefinger. Wool. In combat conditions, this would be a liability. The crowd tensed collectively at the physical contact. Everyone who visited the palace knew the cardinal rule. Never touch the guards. He just touched him, a young American tourist whispered loudly to her companion. You're not supposed to do that. Hayes's hand moved toward Barrett's rifle, fingers brushing against the barrel as he commented, "Ceremonial weapon? Or actually functional?" An audible murmur ran through the gathering crowd at this second violation of protocol. Palace security personnel were moving closer now, though still maintaining diplomatic discretion given the visitor's military status. Hayes positioned himself squarely before Barrett, deliberately blocking his line of sight, a third violation of the protocols clearly posted for visitors. "The difference is responsiveness," Hayes continued. "A Marine Guard acknowledges superior officers, maintains situational awareness, responds to changing conditions." Hayes straightened to his full height, assuming a formal military bearing that signaled he was about to make an official declaration. "Guard," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable command tone of a senior officer. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes, United States Marine Corps, NATO Joint Command authorized. Military protocol across Allied forces requires junior personnel to render appropriate respect to senior officers. This is a direct order from a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps," Hayes stated, each word precisely enunciated. "Salute me now." The demand hung in the air like the report of a rifle shot. For one extended moment, Sergeant William Barrett remained perfectly motionless, his eyes fixed forward in the disciplined thousand-year stare that had remained unbroken throughout Hayes's escalating provocations. The change in Sergeant Barrett's demeanor was so precisely controlled that observers later described it as mechanical in its perfection. One moment he stood in ceremonial stillness, the next, his white-gloved hand moved with fluid efficiency to remove Hayes's fingers from his rifle. "Sir," Barrett spoke, his voice carrying the crisp articulation of British military precision. "You are in violation of standing orders regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard. Physical contact with a guard or his equipment constitutes a Category B security infraction." Hayes's expression shifted from commanding to momentarily stunned, clearly not expecting any response, let alone one delivered with such unapologetic authority. "Furthermore," Barrett continued, his gaze now directly meeting Hayes's, "while your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, Standing Palace Protocol establishes clear guidelines regarding the chain of command while on royal grounds. The Queen's Guard operates under the direct authority of the Crown, not NATO command structure. Standing Order 157 specifically addresses interaction with Allied military personnel," Barrett stated, reciting from memory with mechanical precision. "Guards will maintain position and bearing regardless of visiting military rank, as their oath is sworn first to the sovereign. My duty is to the Crown first, Lieutenant Colonel. That duty includes maintaining prescribed position, bearing, and protocol regardless of external military authority." His delivery remained respectful yet unyielding. "This isn't a matter of disrespect to your rank, sir, but rather absolute respect for the oath of service I have sworn." Barrett's white-gloved hand returned to his rifle in a motion so fluid it seemed choreographed, resuming his ceremonial position with perfect precision. "I must respectfully request you step back to the designated viewing area and refrain from further physical contact with palace guards or equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." Captain Richard Wells's voice broke the tension as he approached with measured strides. "I believe there might be some misunderstanding regarding protocol on palace grounds. Captain Wells, Guard Commander," he introduced himself with a crisp nod. "I see you've been discussing protocol with Sergeant Barrett," Hayes stated, his tone suggesting this validated his earlier comments about ceremonial rigidity. "Indeed, sir," Captain Wells replied evenly. Sergeant Barrett followed Standing Order 157, paragraph 3. In the event of physical contact or immediate security concerns, guards are authorized to respond with minimum necessary communication and action. His delivery was factual rather than defensive, a textbook response to the situation. The Queen's Guard operates under a unique command structure while on palace duty, Captain Wells explained as they moved to a more private corner of the palace grounds. While we acknowledge NATO command protocols in joint operations, palace grounds fall under the direct authority of the sovereign, superseding standard military chain of command for visiting officers. Hayes's posture remained rigid, his jaw clenched as he listened. "In 30 years of military service across 4 continents, I've never encountered a junior officer who refused a direct order from a superior." "That's because Sergeant Barrett wasn't refusing an order, Lieutenant Colonel," Wells clarified. He was following his primary standing orders, which specify that on palace grounds, his chain of command flows through the Crown, not visiting military personnel regardless of rank. Several yards away, the retired British military officer who had spoken up earlier was explaining the situation to a group of curious American tourists. "The Royal Guards aren't just ceremonial figures," he told them quietly. "They're active combat soldiers, many with multiple deployments. Barrett there served with distinction in Afghanistan alongside American forces." Colonel Wilson had finally located Hayes and approached with barely concealed frustration. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is awaiting your return," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "Perhaps I might offer some context," Wells said, addressing both American officers. "Now, the guards you see today completed a 6-month combat deployment just 8 weeks ago. Sergeant Barrett himself was awarded a commendation for actions under fire during a joint operation with American Special Forces. The same men you see standing guard today could be deployed to a conflict zone next month." Hayes's expression remained skeptical. "Different training philosophies. American forces prioritize tactical flexibility, as do we," Wells replied smoothly. "But we consider the discipline of ceremonial duty to be complementary to combat readiness, not contradictory. The ability to maintain absolute focus and position under public scrutiny translates effectively to maintaining discipline under fire." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "An interesting perspective, Captain. I've observed similar benefits from drill precision in our own forces." Hayes shifted impatiently. "With respect, sir, there's a substantial difference between drill discipline and standing motionless for tourists." "Is there?" Wells questioned mildly. "Both require absolute control, perfect execution under observation, and subordination of personal comfort to duty requirements." Wilson ended the exchange with a firm, "We need to rejoin our delegation, Lieutenant Colonel." "Now, ridiculous theatrical nonsense," Hayes muttered as Colonel Wilson escorted him firmly back toward the American delegation. "Standing around in bright red targets, pretending it's military discipline." "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Wilson said then, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a commanding officer who rarely needed to raise it. "You've created a diplomatic incident on what was supposed to be a routine goodwill visit." They rejoined the American delegation, several officers glancing curiously at Hayes before diplomatically averting their eyes. British inflexibility hasn't changed since colonial times, Hayes remarked to Major Davis loud enough for nearby officers to hear. They cling to outdated protocols and call it tradition. The other American officers created subtle distance between themselves and Hayes as the tour continued, his isolation becoming increasingly apparent. Across the palace grounds, Sergeant Barrett maintained his post with perfect composure. If the confrontation had affected him in any way, there was no outward sign. The American delegation completed their tour, proceeding toward the gates where their motorcade awaited. As they passed near Barrett's post, several officers, including Colonel Wilson, offered respectful nods, subtle acknowledgments of professional courtesy that pointedly excluded Hayes. "They're soldiers, not statues," Hayes said as they approached the vehicles, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "Military effectiveness is measured by adaptability, not theatrical performance." "Interesting perspective, Lieutenant Colonel," replied an American general who had remained silent throughout the earlier incidents. "Though I noted that Sergeant Barrett adapted quite effectively to your challenge, his response was both appropriate and professionally delivered." Hayes's expression tightened. "A rehearsed response to a predictable situation isn't adaptability, sir. It's script following." "Perhaps," the general mused, "but it resolved the situation decisively while maintaining protocol. Tactical objective achieved with minimum necessary force. Sounds rather effective to me."